Hello, welcome to Web of Stories. My name is Melinda, and this is attempt number 2 at doing my weekly wrap-up. My first video, I don't know what was going on with it, but it didn't turn out, so we're going to do this over again. Hello, I hope you all had a good week. We are well into December now, and we are starting to get ready for the holidays here, although my house is kind of a little bit more of a disaster than usual, although this time it's, oh, my living is a little crooked, sorry. My husband last weekend, we have an artificial tree because I'm allergic to the real trees. And he got our tree out and he set it up and he went to put the lights on and they all died. So he had to order more lights, which did come yesterday. But when they died, like everything, all the boxes and everything just kind of stayed. So we're at the point now where the kids, we have the lights on, we have the garland on, the kids can start decorating. So we'll see. Hopefully next week it'll be actually Christmassy in here. Probably not behind me though. Boring corner will stay boring. So before I get into this week, I just wanted to pass on that I got an email, or a lot of people got an email, from Robert Sheard, who runs the BookTube Prize, and he is looking for some more judges. He'd like to have a few more judges. If you haven't done the BookTube Prize and you're thinking about it, this would be a good year to do it. You do not have to do every round. The only kind of requirement is if you want to judge in the final round, you have to have done one other round. I did 3 of the 4 rounds last year. I plan to do 3 of the 4 rounds this year. The only difference is I'm not going to do the first round, only because that's February and March, and then we go on vacation in March, so it limits my time. So I'm just not going to start till the second round. You do not have to have a BookTube channel. You don't even have to have a Bookstagram account. Anybody can join. I will link the call for judges video down below, and you can watch that and get more information. It is 6 books to read over 2 months, which sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. And also, if you do more than one round, like the chances are you won't have 6 books. You'll be assigned 6 books, but you'll probably have already read some of them. So it gets a little bit later going on. Someone, I think it was Heidi at My Reading Life this last year, when she got to the final round, she'd already read all the books. So she didn't have anything to read in the last round. So that is a possibility too. I think she did every round. So there you go. Anyway, I really enjoyed doing it this year. I am going to do it again next year. I'm going to stay with nonfiction. You can do fiction or nonfiction or either. If the either one, sometime one round you might get fiction and the next round you might get nonfiction. It's just wherever judges are needed. But I've really, really enjoyed it. And I think that, I would encourage anyone who hasn't done it before and is kind of curious to give it a try. So again, I'm linking the video down below. Now, I finished 2 books. Okay. So on my reading log, I finished 2 books this week, but there's actually another book that I finished that's not kind of counted with my reading, but I wanted to touch base on it because I want to rave about it. And if you've watched my channel, I talk about bedtime stories. So what I do to fall asleep is I put an audiobook on for, I set the timer for half an hour. I usually don't make it half an hour. And it's always a book I've already read. Hence why I don't really count it towards my reading. It doesn't go to my reading total or anything like that. It's always a book I've already read, and that I like, and it's somewhat comforting to me. And I have done, so far in the past, I've done the first couple Cork O'Connor books. Probably won't continue doing those only because I don't like the narrator. I've done the first Louise Penny book. I'm currently listening to the second Louise Penny book. One I did that was really good was The Great Gatsby, narrated by Jake Gyllenhaal, which is an Audible exclusive. And that was a great one. He had a very understated performance. And I do say performance because that's what it was. He really was inhabiting these characters, but he has a nice soothing voice. So it was great for bedtime stories. But the one I want to talk about is just the night before last, I finished listening to Wuthering Heights, narrated by Joanne Froggatt. If you don't know who she is, she played Anna on, or I guess it still plays because they keep making movies of it, on Downton Abbey. This was the best performance in an audiobook I have ever heard. Wuthering Heights is a difficult book, I would think, to narrate it because there's such highs and such lows, and there's so much emotion in it. good emotion, bad emotion. There's just a lot of emotion in it. And she just brought it all to life. There's also some very unlikable characters in it, and she did them very well. Not in a way that made you like them, because they are unlikable characters, but in a way that they were still interesting. Just fantastic. So if you want to listen to an audiobook of Wuthering Heights, whether or not you have read it before, I would recommend this one by Joanne Froggatt. Unfortunately, it is also an Audible exclusive, so you can only get it on Audible, but it to me, it's worth it. I would completely do it. So anyway, I just wanted to share that. Now, let me get to the books I finished this week. I finished two. The cat's over there making noise. I finished two books. They're both library books. I don't even know what she's doing there. I think there's a box and she's trying to climb into it. I don't know. The first one was an audiobook, and this is White Rural. Rural is a very hard word to say, just saying. White Rural Rage by Tom Schaller and Paul Waldman. Two authors. I will probably just refer to the author in the singular. That's what I did the first time I filmed this, but you know what I mean. And it was audio, so there was like one male narrator. This book is a very political book. If you don't want to hear about that, I mean, I can't talk about it without talking about politics, because that's what it's about. If you don't want to hear about that, that's fine. I will timestamp it and you can skip to the second book, which is Sister Mother Warrior. But let me go back to White Rural Rage. So the message of this book, or the point of this book, is to discuss why in the United States, especially 2016, 2020, this book did come out earlier in 2024, so before the election, why the white rural population tended to go so strong for Donald Trump. And his hypothesis, you know what I mean? I'm talking about both authors, was that even though the Republican Party has nothing to offer them, nothing, there's nothing in their platform to offer the rural community. And even though the Democratic Party does have actual things that to offer the rural community that would make their lives easier, even with those, Donald Trump, the Republicans, but especially Donald Trump, have been able to tap into a rage that white rural communities feel, for the most part. Obviously, that is actually one issue I kind of had with this book, is it was very, how should I put this? This book is not meant for white rural folk. This book is meant for people who did not vote for Donald Trump and want to know why other people did. People who live in cities and suburbs. This is not a book for Republicans. There's a lot of disdain by the authors towards the people they're writing about. So there's that, and I just don't think that's productive. So there's that. But their point is, or their message is, in the rural community, there's this feeling of they're being left behind, this rage that comes from this feeling of being left behind and not being seen as important, and which is a fallacy, because actually the way the United States government is set up, the way our democracy operates, we're speaking on federal elections at this point, at the federal level, because states are different. I don't want to talk at the state level, although I will talk about Oregon in a second. On a federal level, the way things are set up, people in rural communities have an outsized voice with their vote. And try to explain this in numbers. This is going to be a little bit hard. So we're going to compare two states. And again, these are for federal elections. Every state, if you aren't in the United States and you don't know how this works, every state has at least three electoral votes. So electoral votes are what go to elect the president. And what they're saying doesn't apply just to the president, but this is kind of an illustration of what they're talking about. So we're going to look at the state of Wyoming, which has 3 electoral votes. So all states get an electoral vote for each senator. Every state has 2 senators, and an electoral vote for each representative. And each state has at least 1 representative. So Wyoming has 3 electoral votes, 2 senators, 1 state representative. And the number of state representatives is based on population. California has a lot more. I think it's 55. I'm not sure about that because California is our most populous state. So it has like 55, we're going to say, electoral votes. So you would think, oh yeah, well, California has more of a say. Well, yeah, California has more electoral votes, but if you're looking at a person level, the number of people represented by one electoral vote, am I doing this right? One electoral vote. There's 17 times, I think that's the number, 17 times more people in California represented by one electoral vote than in Wyoming, which means that if you're in Wyoming, your vote for federal elections, was basically president, is 17 times louder than if you're in California. So that's what they mean. And also, because every state has two senators, regardless of how many people there are, and there are states that are so rural, senators from non-rural states or states that are only that have urban areas and suburban areas represent more people, so they have less of the power than the more rural states where the senators represent less people with the same number. It's a numbers thing. Anyway, again, at the state level, every state is different, so I can't talk about every state, but I can talk about Oregon because that's my state. And I've also gotten into, we'll say, discussions with people in comments on Facebook. So I kind of know where the thought process is. And to let you know a little bit about the state of Oregon. So Oregon is like the 10th largest state in the union. And it's basically two parts of Oregon. The western third of the state, there's the Cascade Mountains that kind of divide it. There's that. And then there's the eastern 2/3 of the state. The western part of the state, that's where you have Portland, Salem, Eugene, you have all these cities. You know, that's where the metropolitan areas are. And they're not all blue or Democrat predominantly, but that's where most of the people are. And then on the eastern side of the state, you have a lot of wide open country. And yes, there are towns there. None of them are big. None of them are big. I think there's Pendleton, which is a tiny town except for the week of Pendleton Roundup in September. And there's Baker City, which isn't that big. I mean, there's not a lot on the western part of Oregon, the eastern part of Oregon. So if you look at one of those very misleading maps that people on the right like to throw out, where they have the red and the blue, but it's all geography. So it looks like everything's really red when actually it's really blue, because the people are more concentrated. Well, most of the people live on the western side of the state, and we're more concentrated. So a lot of the people that I have talked to who live in the eastern part of the state say this is very, very unfair that Portland decides everything. Portland, I live in the Portland metro area, so I live in a suburb of Portland, is the biggest city in the state. It's not the capital, but it's the biggest city of the state, and it has a large metro area with a number of suburbs. And that means that there's a lot of people who live there. So yes, when you vote in a statewide election, people in that area, because that's where the people are you're going to have more votes from that area because there are more people to vote from that area. Oregon is, I don't know if it's exactly a unique state, but not all states can claim this. Oregon is a non-gerrymandered state. So our districts are really pretty fairly, our different districts are really fairly divided up by population. They're all about the same population-ish. Some are a little, within reason, they're about the same size. Because of that, the Oregon State Legislature is a very accurate representation of the electorate in Oregon. For as long as I can remember, there's two houses, just like in Congress, there's two houses in our legislature. As long as I can remember, there's been a supermajority for the Democrats in at least one house. In our next session, in our next upcoming session, we'll have a supermajority in both houses. So Oregon, people talk about in the West and, in the East and farther South, they're not very blue. Yes, but not many people live there. So Oregon is probably, yes, there are people who are very conservative in Oregon. And this leads you to the Greater Idaho movement. That's a whole thing. But Oregon is really the majority of people in Oregon are progressive. The majority of people in Oregon live in the I-5 corridor, which is, on the western side of the state. So even though people on the eastern side and in the more rural areas in Oregon are getting the same representation as someone who lives in Portland or Eugene or Salem, they feel like they aren't getting, because they aren't getting their way. Even though it's a democracy, it's most votes is the winner. Whatever gets the most votes wins. And they have this argument that they should get more to even out people on the western side of the state, which that's not a democracy. That's not the way this works. So I know that's an argument that happens, and that is an argument that these authors bring up and they talk about. There wasn't really anything in this book that surprised me. They did have this one part. This didn't surprise me. It was just kind of an eye-opener, where they talked to a congressman from Texas who had a fairly rural district. And this is a U.S. congressman. Roy, I think was his name. Anyway, they went to one of his campaign events. Again, this is the guy who has a pretty rural district. And after the campaign event, they went and they talked to him and they asked him, what are your plans for these issues that are of importance to people in your rural communities? And the congressman just said, nothing. I don't care. I don't have anything for it. I'm just worried about the border. His district is not on the border. So that's sort of the attitude for, they say all Republicans, I don't know if that's true because I don't know at the state level what things are like, have towards the rural community. So there wasn't anything, there were some little things like that, but really most of their arguments weren't anything new to me. But here's my big problem with this book, beyond the fact that it was a very, the whole thing was people in rural communities are so dismissive of people in the cities and the suburbs, which, yeah, they probably are, but you're doing the same thing the other way. See what I mean? It's a little hypocritical. But what really got me is when you read a book like this, and again, this book is not for people in rural communities. This book is not for Republicans. This is a book for urban and suburban Democrats, or progressives, we should say. There needs to be a call to action in this book. Suggestions or ideas to try to fix the situation, right? And the big problem is, really, I would say the call to action should be, Democrats need to figure out how to communicate, and Democrats are terrible at communicating. They just are. How to communicate their plans to the rural community so that the rural community understands what Democrats are proposing and how this benefits them in a way that they will hear it and understand it. That to me would be the call to action, and there would be ideas about how to do this, blah, blah, blah. That's not what they suggest. What their suggestion is, people in rural communities need to find better Republicans. What? The Republicans are not reading this book. I kind of lost it at the end. This is not a book I can recommend. So yeah, that was not a good one. The second book, okay, we're done talking about politics. The second book was this one, and this is from my library book group, which I'm filming this on Friday. I'll be dropping it on Saturday. And so I'll be discussing this on Saturday with my book group, and I'm going to try and get it to the light. Yeah, that's it. But this is Sister, Mother, Warrior by Vanessa Riley. So this is historical fiction, and it focuses on two women. Both of these women were real historical figures. I don't know if these women were really connected in real life, but both of these are they were historical figures, but there's not much known about them. So the fiction part of historical fiction does a lot of heavy work, and that's fine. Riley does include an author's note that's pretty comprehensive about her, what she had to have, why she did it, the research, which I think is perfectly appropriate. But the two women, and this is set during the Haitian Revolution, which is at the end of the 18th century. And it was it sounds like from this book. Now, I know very little about the Haitian Revolution, so going into this, I didn't have a lot of pre-knowledge. Most of my knowledge comes from this book. It seems to be partially kind of like a pawn in wars in European powers between Spain and France for a while, but then it also became a bit of an uprising of enslaved people because they did have slavery there. But the important thing is one of the leaders of that was a man called Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who is in this book. So the characters in this book, there is a woman who is referred to by many names, but mostly Grand Toya. She was a West African warrior who was sold into slavery, brought over by the Middle Passage over to Haiti and worked on a plantation. She was friends with, he became a Jean-Jacques Dessalines, his mother, and then when his mother died, she basically raised him, and she raised him to be a warrior. She would raise the children to be warriors. The other woman is a woman named Marie Claire, who does end up marrying Jean-Jacques Dessalines. She becomes the first empress of Haiti. That's what they refer to her as. So these two women, they're kind of tied together through Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And there were a lot of things I liked about this book. As I said, I didn't know a lot about the Haitian Revolution going into it, so I learned a lot. I thought, for the most part, these two characters were drawn really, really well. Vanessa Riley does have to, just by the nature of things, address a number of issues. I think she did fairly well on those. But the characters themselves were well drawn. I could usually understand what the motivation behind their decisions were. They were sympathetic characters in that I wanted to know that good things would happen for them. I wanted to know what was going on with them. That's all great. What didn't work for me, first of all, one very petty thing, which is just an irritation of mine. In what year? I think it was 2018. This book came out in what, 2020, 22? Gotta look it up here. I should have done 2022. Like 2018. I think that's the year that Hamilton debuted on Broadway. And since then, I have noticed in various pieces of entertainment, which might touch on the character of Alexander Hamilton, that they kind of go all in on him because it's Alexander Hamilton, and they really kind of over-pronounce him. They overemphasize him. A really clear example of this, which is not from this book, is from the TV show Turn, which is about the cult perspiring, which Alexander Hamilton didn't have anything to do with. Not much anyway. Alexander Hamilton doesn't show up until the 3rd season, and he shows up in a scene where I even meant to look this guy's name up. It was a British officer. He had worked with Benedict Arnold and Benedict Arnold's treason thing. I can't remember his name. I'll put it down here. He'd been captured by the revolution, by the Americans, he's called that, the Continental Army, and he was going to be executed. And Alexander Hamilton was there for his execution. Alexander Hamilton's entire job at this was to take notes. Historically, he was there to take notes. That was it. But in the scene, it's like, this is Alexander Hamilton. This is Alexander Hamilton. And it was just like overkill to the point that it totally distracted from the rest of the story. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. That happens a little bit in this book. It just sort of sets my teeth on edge. And yeah, there's reason to reference Alexander Hamilton in this book. There is reason to. Not really the way to handle it the way it was. And I just feel like that's the Hamilton effect. And as much as I love Hamilton, I don't really like that. So there's that. My second issue is, while these two characters are connected through Jean-Jacques Dessalines, they aren't really connected for most of the book, and I kind of felt like for most of this book I was reading two different stories, and that was frustrating. I think that this could have been written, because so much of it had to be created by Riley because so little is known about these women. I think she probably could have done it in a way somehow that tied them a little bit more closely together. But for 2/3 of the book, I just felt like I was reading two different books. And finally, there is a large part of this book, which is a sort of a romantic subplot between Marie Claire and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And I didn't buy it. I just didn't buy it. I couldn't understand what she saw in him. It didn't make sense to me. He was a philanderer. I'm like, maybe it's just me. I'm like, why would you put up with this? To the point where he's like, can you raise all my children from these other women? What? I just couldn't buy that part of the story. And it's a very important part of the story. So that was, So there's enough here to recommend the book, just probably wouldn't be one of my favorites. All this being said, of course, I'm discussing it with my book group tomorrow. I've been known to change my mind. So there you go. That was my reading week. This video went long. I'm sorry. I'm going to turn it off now. So thank you very much for joining me. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.